not at any rate heard of Brent Elliott, who is both the librarian of the RHS and also the author of that very famous book, The Victorian Garden. And he's talking to us today on Victorian planting.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I was not able to be here during the first part of the conference, but correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that our purpose here today is to provide some general instruction for what to do when you have to restore a park or a garden and you don't have exact documentation about what it was like. Yes. Right. Well, as it happens, you are not the first generation to face this problem. The problem first arose in the Victorian period. So let me say a few words about what happened when it did. Not so much because it will give you any helpful hints, but just might provide you with a sense of history and belonging in time. Let's start with what is no doubt a familiar garden, Levens Hall in Cumbria. John Claudius Loudon visited here in the early 1840s and complained about the gardener's practice in planting dahlias and other modern plants in beds around the topiary. Inappropriate in this genuine specimen of garden history. Well, the genuineness of the topiary at Levens Hall might be called into question. First of all, because nobody seems to have mentioned it until the 19th century, despite temptation to if you were describing Levens. Secondly, from the fact that a certain amount of the topiary is of golden yew, which was not commercially available at the time the topiary garden was allegedly set out circa 1700. And lastly, and most recently, from the fact that a recent tree survey indicates there's very little of the topiary at Levens that precedes the 20th century. However, we do have adequate illustrations to know that there was something of a topiary garden there in the 19th, and no real evidence for its presence before that. At any rate, by the 1840s, it was already sufficiently mature to fool Loudon. Now, this attitude that you ought not to mix the modern introduction with genuine specimens of ancient gardening was very much a minority view at first. In fact, it's difficult before 1850 to think of anybody other than Loudon making this objection, but in the last third of the century, it became presented ever more vocably. And when it was, late in the century, a counter-argument was produced by gardeners committed to experimental horticulture. It's an argument that I assume could have been made earlier, but just wasn't because nobody asked the right question. And that was, we know that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the period which we're trying to imitate because everybody knows the English arts were at their peak during that period, witness Shakespeare, so gardening must have been at its peak also. People were busy planting their gardens with the tulips and irises and fritillaries and so on introduced from the Turkish Empire. If they had had pelargoniums and tuberous begonias, they would have planted them too, so why can't we? So this is the monk's garden at Ashridge, and no incongruity felt about planting it up with the latest pelargoniums. However, from the late 1860s on, you can see a definite parting of the ways between those who frequently use designs modeled on historical precedent, but modern horticulture, and those whose determination to be accurate to the period they were restoring to had begun to extend to planting as well as design. And you can find this dichotomy neatly epitomized in the gardens of two opposing prime ministers. That's Gladstone's garden at Harden Castle, nice bright summer bedding. And that's Disraeli's garden at Hewenden Manor. When he arrived, he quote, de-Victorianized, or at least de-high Victorianized, if you can allow that term, removed most of the beds from the lawn, turned the border near the house over to hardy plants, particularly primulas, and installed a bit of architectural topiary. And thereafter, progressively, the rift between the historical revivalists and the ornamental horticulturists widens. Although today the name of William Robinson is usually thought of first as the person who reacted against the High Victorian period, many of the practical and long-standing aspects of this reaction came rather from people like Reginald Blomfield and the arts and crafts architects. It was Blomfield more than Robinson who was enthusiastic about bringing native plants into the garden and replacing exotic conifers with native fruit trees. Penshurst Place, as an example. And at Penshurst, which George Deavy was restoring at intervals between the 1850s and the 1880s, he gave instructions that he redesigned the parterre, modeling it on an engraving by Kip, and gave instructions that only plants that were known to have been around at the time of the engraving should be used. There's an ambiguity about that. As we have moved through history, we have become progressively finicky about our details. So in the late 19th century, to use the plants that were available in the late 17th century, for example, could mean to buy the latest delphinium cultivars from Kelway's. It was the genus and the species rather than the particular varieties that were important. So a revivalist planting scheme of the late 19th century could quite easily use very modern plants as long as they belonged to the right old-fashioned categories. Well, I've said enough to let you see how one strand of 20th century gardening has developed out of that split, and a strand that seems, in one sense or another, to lead to this room today. Now let's go jumping back to the beginning of the 19th century and look at the broader question of Victorian planting, and specifically the planting of the flower garden, that being partly a revival, partly an innovation of the Victorian period, and that part of gardening about which the most intense and enthusiastic and sometimes angry discussions appeared in the literature. Now, the general Victorian attitude toward the 18th century was rather like that of the 20th century toward the 19th. It was the nadir of bad taste, and a thoroughgoing reaction against it was appropriate. This meant, among other things, abandoning the tendency to make a garden look as if it were the work of unaided nature, whatever you understood the work of unaided nature to be. Between the followers of Capability Brown and the followers of Richard Payne Knight, there were several degrees of difference of opinion on the matter, but the ideal was still the same, and that ideal was rejected in the 19th century. By the 1830s, John Claudius Loudon was loudly proclaiming that gardens were works of art, not of nature, and they ought to be seen to be works of art. Any attempt to make the garden look like the work of unaided nature was an attempt to deceive the spectator, and therefore in bad taste. So during the second quarter of the 19th century, the word artifice is a very honorific term to use for anything happening in the garden. Now, one thing that the 18th century and previous centuries generally do not discuss in their gardening literature, outside the occasional scattered reference, is what to do about color in the garden. The idea of arranging color in any systematic fashion barely appears in literature before the 19th century. This is from a color illustrated edition of Whately's Observations on Modern Gardening, published in 1800, and you can see its color scheme is based on picturesque painting of the 17th and 18th century. You have your earth colors at the bottom of the canvas, brown in other words. You have your air colors at the top, just exactly how the fire and water colors are to be mixed in the middle, nobody says. And for a landscape garden of this sort, that might be quite sufficient, but it doesn't help with a flower garden, as the writers in horticultural journals loved to remind the reader during the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. What has the artist to do with the parterre? Artists are only interested in painting naturalistic scenes. They're of no help whatsoever in the garden. Now, this may be inaccurate, but the impression that one gets from the Victorian literature is that previous generations merely mixed their flowers together indiscriminately in the flower garden and made no attempt to group them by color. One can think of exceptions to this. William Mason, for example, drew up a red, white, and blue color scheme for one garden, but that's only been discovered fairly recently. That information was not available to the Victorians. So that stands as a representative of what the Victorians thought previous generations did in the flower garden. This is from Maria Jackson's Florist's Manual in the 1820s. And the first wave of Victorian artifice here lay more in the shape of the beds, and both in the pattern on the ground and sometimes in three-dimensional quality than in color. Here we see the origin of the basket bed. This is from Repton's plans for the Brighton Pavilion. And during the early 19th century, beds that suggested the shape of a rustic flower basket were very popular. There you can see some examples from Loudon's Gardener's Magazine. And by mid-century, when the fashion finally faded, they were getting bigger and better. There's an example from Linton Park in Kent, and if you look on the right, you will see a human figure for scale. However, during the 1820s, Loudon principally, others as well, began campaigning for the more deliberate use of color in the flower garden, and what became known as massing as opposed to mixing. In a mixture, any two slices of the flower garden were essentially the same because there was no particular means of distinguishing any part from any other. What you wanted for true variety was not an indiscriminate mixture of plants, but solid blocks of different colors. And the idea of having solid blocks of color preceded the physical possibility by several years. However, here in 1829, from the Gardener's Magazine, we find an illustration of a flower garden which is laid out in blocks of one plant per bed. And if you look at the list at the bottom, you can see pelargoniums, fuchsias, calceolarias, some of these just introduced within the previous decade. Now, by comparison with the sort of mixed flower planting Loudon et al. Were criticizing, you could consider this to be solid blocks of one color. You would not consider it so by comparing it with a bedding scheme today, because the plants here used are wild species. They are not bedding plants as we now understand them. For example, I have introduced here the wrong slide. This ought to have been a slide of an early pelargonium introduction, and instead it's Julia tricolor. Never mind. The early pelargoniums introduced from South Africa were rather straggly plants, frequently woody-stemmed. The size of the flowers was fairly small in relation to the size of the total plant and of its foliage. But once the demand for solid blocks of color was there, private gardeners and nurserymen began undertaking programs of selective breeding, crossing plants with shorter habit with those with brighter flowers in the hope of getting new forms that were more compact and in which the flower size would be much more dominant by comparison with the size of the foliage. Oh, there's our early pelargonium. This is from Andrew's geraniums of about 1806. And if you look at that, you can see the woody stem at the base. Not a plant that a bed of which would really constitute a solid mass of one color. Jump ahead to the end of the 1840s, and the proportions of new hybrid pelargoniums were coming down to this. Fairly large flowers in a compact truss above a fairly low amount of foliage. The 1840s saw the introduction of what we now call proper bedding varieties of pelargoniums, petunias, verbenas, and calceolarias, and by the middle of the 1850s, these had become the four dominant plants for filling the flower garden in front of the windows, the parterre, in other words. Now, a lovely dark slide. You will not be able to read any of the writing in that bottom left panel. But this is only a slight exaggeration of how difficult it is to read anyway, because the plan is very fragmentary. This was the information that English Heritage basically had to work on, along with 4 watercolors, for the restoration of the parterre at Audley End, a work of the 1830s. The plan is dated 1833, and with the best will in the world, we were unable to decipher all of it. But it was a key to different beds, and some of them read something effaced: verbenas, herbaceous plants, ... fuchsias, verbenas, eschscholtzias, geraniums, etc. Again, in many cases, these are plants that were only introduced to England in the previous decade. And if you want to find an example of a flower garden at the beginning of the Victorian period restored today, Audley End is the place to go. There is a mixture of beds, an inappropriate term considering the opposition of mixing and massing in the Victorian vocabulary. There are 2 types of beds, There are the beds devoted to one plant alone, and there are the beds devoted to a variety of plants, usually either mixed annuals or mixed perennials. Fortunately, in trying to restore a garden of this period, we are dealing as yet with very little in the way of cultivated varieties. Most of the plants used in 1833 in these circumstances would have been species and are therefore reasonably recoverable. Well, this is John Kay, the Duke of Bedford's head gardener at his London estate at Campden Hill. And in 1838, Kay began publishing articles on the systematic arrangement of colours in the Gardener's Magazine. And he was later looked back on as the person who had got what became known as the bedding system properly established. And among the rules, the first is, beds should be organized as solid masses of one color, not indiscriminate mixtures. Now, I'm not sure whether I have time to dilate on the question of harmony of color. When Kay started out planting his beds, as you can see, there's a great number of fairly small beds, each devoted to a different species. And at this point, few of what we would now consider the Victorian bedding plants were yet available. And the bulk of the plants were what were then called Californian annuals, Gilias, Eschscholtzias, Coreopsis, etc., many of them introduced by David Douglas during the 1820s. During the 1840s, Kay published one plan in color. The limitations of color printing in the 19th century magazines mean both it's a rare phenomenon in the 1840s, and B, you can't always rely on the color printing to be very precisely accurate, but I think it gives the effect sufficiently, apart from its attempt to escape from the frame. Anybody would like to describe this as a harmonious combination of colors? Let's get some audience participation here. Would anybody like to say why not? I hear the word contrast. Is that supposed to be an alternative to a harmony? Why? Sorry? Well, not exactly opposite ends, but separated in the color spectrum. And you're still not explaining why you deduce that this is not harmonious. Well, so as not to let the lecture stretch out to the crack of doom, let me say that if you take the idea of harmony in color seriously, then this is a harmonious color scheme. There is, after all, no such thing as harmony of color. Harmony is a metaphor derived from music, and there is nothing in the phenomenon of light and color to approximate the phenomenon of repeating quantities of cycles per second that gives us our octave pattern. But for centuries, people thought there was. The reason there are 7 colors in the rainbow is because Newton was so persuaded that there had to be 7 because there were 7 tones in the diatonic system. And hence he gave that little muddle at the right-hand side where nobody ever agrees where blue, indigo, and violet have their boundaries. Now, if you play together 2 notes that are adjacent on the piano, say C and D, do you get a harmonious sound? You get a discord. So by analogy, if you place together 2 colors that are adjacent in the spectrum, you should also get a discord. So red and orange side by side are discordant. They are not harmonious. But red, yellow, and blue gives you the equivalent of a major triad. Red and green gives you equivalent of, say, C and F. And this, while this sort of thinking is unfamiliar today, in the manuals of the period, you do find it. First of all, this is from George Field's book on chromatics in the early 19th century, showing the notion that you have primary colors and the secondary colors are formed by their combination. So when you see orange, it's a combination of red and yellow. So orange is a color in which you can trace red and you can trace yellow. And from David Ramsay Hayes' book on color theory in the 1840s, you can see the attempt to define colors in terms of the chromatic scale. So, at a time when harmony of color was taken literally, that is the sort of color arrangement that you got. What happened was that during the 1850s and 60s, the idea that there was an analogy between light and sound, or between color and music, was exploded. And the scientific basis for any talk about harmony of color was rendered obsolete. But the term had become so familiar that nobody was willing to do without it, and it settled down to mean the color combinations that were particularly approved at that moment. And ever since then, we have been stuck with the notion that colors are harmonious when they're adjacent in the spectrum and clashing when they're separated. A complete reversal of the position 50 years earlier. Now, as the bedding plants began to emerge in the 1840s, they swept away the Californian annuals and a great many of the plants that had been used in the parterre before that. And by the period from about 1845 to 1860 is dominated in the parterre by 4 genera. Pelargoniums above all, the one genus that never really disappeared entirely from fashion, however much the Edwardians may have often grumbled about it, and which certainly never disappeared from cultivation. And verbenas, petunias, and lastly, really coming to prominence in 1854, calceolarias. And here, these plants went out of favor for the parterre in the late 19th century, petunias and verbenas, because of uncertainties of the English climate more than anything else. And the result is there are no surviving examples of Victorian cultivars of verbenas, petunias, or calceolarias. And there aren't that many illustrations either. So if you want to create a bedding system garden of the 1840s to 60s, you are rather stuck, because the plants that you would use are simply not around. And if you see a color scheme which has about 5 different scarlet pelargoniums in it and 3 different purple verbenas, you have no way of knowing whether these are a concept of scarlet pelargonium that any modern cultivar might reasonably replicate, or whether there are some precise tonal differences between them that made their positioning rather important. We don't know, and we don't have the plants, so we won't be able to find out. This does admittedly pose a problem for restoring a high Victorian garden, nor do I have any wonderful answer for how to do it, except to do exactly what the Victorian gardeners of the period did: experiment. A few more color schemes. I've managed to put this one upside down. This is from the Harewood papers, just to show you the interesting color schemes of the period. That one from Drumlanrig Castle. That one from Charles Mackintosh's Book of the Garden in the 1850s, showing above all the limitations of the period's printer's inks to indicate color accurately. Now, during the 1840s, a new and rival concept of color coordination was introduced, and this was the idea of complementary colors, which is really introduced by the French chemist Michel-Eugène Chevreul. It was being propounded in the pages of the Gardener's Chronicle years before Chevreul's book was translated into English. I'm doing well for getting slides upside down. I hope we don't get a garden view upside down. Again, making allowance for the fact that the printer's inks do not give you exactly the effect you want. If you look fixedly for a while at one of those concentric circles, and then you shift your gaze to the white screen, you should see more or less the color values reversed in the after image. If you look at the one at the bottom, and then look at the white of the screen, you should see a more or less green circle with a red ring around it. And that is what is meant by complementary colors. Now, you will still find books written today, particularly on Impressionist painting, which give you the impression that this is the scientific basis for color combinations. A certain 20th century school of thought will differ. The chemist Wilhelm Ostwald complained that Chevreul had taken green and red inaccurately to be in opposition. Chevreul had produced a series of color circles, the idea being that any 2 opposite points on the circle would give you complementary colors. And according to Ostwald, all of Chevreul's circles were skewed because it's really sea green, not pure green, that is the complementary of red. According to this system, you find complementary colors not by looking at the phenomena of after images, but by shining beams of the colors until they cancel and give you a uniform gray. I have to say that if that is the case, then the National Association of Flower Arrangement Society's recommended color circle is out of kilter. But I haven't heard anybody complain about inappropriate color combinations, from which one might deduce that there is not really a scientific basis to the whole matter. However, it ensured pages and pages of controversy in the gardeners' magazines, particularly in the 1850s, up until the years 1856 to 7, if I remember correctly, when there was, in effect, a sort of national trial carried out with the Horticultural Society's garden at Chiswick and Hampton Court on the side of complementary colours, and Kew and the Crystal Palace on the side of the more traditional bedding. And after 2 seasons, the Horticultural Society and Hampton Court gave up on complementary planting and decided that it really didn't work in practice. Nonetheless, it was revived at periods throughout the 19th century. John Lindley, who had been propagandizing for Chiverol's system in the Gardener's Chronicle, then found another hero, Gardner Wilkinson, the Egyptologist, who had written a book on colour and taste, in which he argued that in any Muslim or Hindu country, any child could produce you a decent colour scheme. Nobody in England seemed able to. You might notice the pattern chosen here to give a demonstration of colours indicates his design preferences as well. And there's a suggestion for how Wilkinson's colour scheme might be used. Again, it attracted a fair amount of attention in the press. We have no idea how widely it was adopted. But from the 1840s to the middle of the 1860s, these debates carried on. Something happened then which I'll come back to later. Now let's have a look at how these principles were put to use in some gardens of the period, insofar as we can with the limitations of the illustrations. So by way of reminding you that these things actually have human beings carrying them out, I'm going to introduce you to a few head gardeners along the way. This is Robert Fish, head gardener at Putteridgebury in Hertfordshire in the 1850s, where he created this floral avenue. As you can see, it's a curvilinear avenue composed of pairs of beds on opposite sides of the walk. These are called pincushion beds on the principle that you can put anything into them, the one necessary principle being that each pair matches. And as all this is an annual phenomenon redone every summer, you could vary the planting, and at least in 1 year, Fish carried out a scheme in which the colours moved from hot to cold down the length of the avenue. But more often, there was probably no systematic arrangement. If you think of that progressive arrangement from hot to cold as being characteristic of Gertrude Jekyll, just remember that the years when she was in art school, she was busy studying the same textbooks of colour that the gardeners in the magazines were being recommended to study as well. And indeed, when she emerged on the scene in the 1880s recommending colour schemes, some of the oppositional correspondence she received said, this person GJ is just doing what the bedding person's been doing all along, only with different plants. This is David Thompson, who in the 1860s was head gardener at Archerfield in Scotland. And by this time, there was the beginnings of a small rebellion against this idea of one solid mass of colour per bed. And some people were arguing that a bed should surely be an object of interest in itself, not just part of a larger scheme. Couldn't beds have distinct edgings and centres that made them rather more interesting to look at? So there you have a series of beds with distinct edgings, with centres, sometimes what became known as dot plants to give a bit of vertical scale. And you also see a couple of human figures to give the scale again. And the idea of giving vertical scale to flower beds had one of a few peaks of popularity at the end of the 1850s, beginning of the 1860s. Here you can see an illustration of pelargoniums being arranged in pyramids. This faded by the early 1860s from the country house circuit, but was revived for the middle class circuit in the 1870s. There's Shirley Hibbard's illustration of how to make a geranium pyramid. You create a sort of cone of clinker and rubble, and you plunge your pot plants in it. As Hibbard was writing for a middle-class audience, he was very keen on plunging pots in beds. It made replanting a great deal easier. This is John Robson, head gardener at Linton Park in Kent in the 1850s and 60s. In the 1850s, the architectural press was discovering the virtues of massiveness in design and recommending that buildings ought to have a solid and imposing silhouette not frittered away by all sorts of detail on the surface. And when this sort of rhetoric hit the gardening press, admittedly not very extensively, Linton Park was the garden that tended to be named. Here in about 1858-9, a new terrace was designed, and Robson created this bed, which was oval, but appeared nearly circular when seen from above. There's the one color scheme for it, not very informative. And eventually he became so obsessive about the purity of the color blocks that he banned from this bed any flowers whose petals cast internal shadows, because that would create a rippling effect that would destroy the purity of the color block. At the same time, in one of the developments in garden design that was achieving the greatest publicity was Nesfield's revival of the Baroque parterre using scrolls of box and gravel, particularly later in his career colored gravels. And in 1862 he issued a press statement about the importance of having parterres of colored gravels that would look equally good in the winter as in the summer. And when the gardening press first encountered Nesfield in the late 1840s, most of the commentators expressed incomprehension of this style of planting. That's the same garden seen from the windows. What was the point of having flower beds that were only 6 inches wide? What on earth could the gardener do with that in terms of creating a good color scheme? Please, Mr. Nesfield, drop this insistence on box and gravel and start using modern plants. Nonetheless, Nesfield's style of gardening was very popular, particularly in aristocratic and nouveau riche estates. And the late 1850s saw the peak of its popularity. Fell away rather sharply at the end of the 1860s. This is, by comparison with a bedding scheme of the period, a rather easy sort of garden to replicate, because as it's not planted for color schemes, it doesn't matter that much what you put in the interstices of the box scrolls. Donald Beaton, one of the major gardening writers of the mid-century, remarked that there are many gardens in which it is hopeless to attempt a good color scheme, probably because they were designed by some great artist. And the only thing that you can do is use mixed planting unless you want to show up the architect. Now, this might have something of the appearance of a Nesfield scheme, but it isn't. This is Castle Ashby, a parterre design made by the Marquis of Northampton himself. And while it includes heraldic monograms and the flowers of the United Kingdom, this is not box and gravel. This is all little ribbons and borders of flowers, which are supposed to have the effect of crossing over each other, etc. I don't have a photograph of that particular bit of the parterre, but I do have a turn-of-the-century photograph of the next panel over, which looked like that. Now, first of all, just imagine what this is like if you're a head gardener. What happens if you have a heavy rainstorm and all the petals get knocked off? Or what happens if some of the plants in one of these little borders grow up taller than the others? I just say this to suggest the reasons for the enthusiasm with which carpet bedding was greeted a few years later. And the other thing to remark about this illustration was published in Country Life. It was reused by Gertrude Jekyll in her book on garden ornament. And in the section on parterres, she wrote that the parterres at Castle Ashby, which were still well maintained a few years ago, were the best example she'd ever seen of the bedding system. And in front of houses like that, it was always and absolutely in place. So those who think of Gertrude Jekyll as being a pure reaction against the High Victorian period, think again. Now, if you want to try to restore a garden of that period, I can point you to one recent example. That horribly dark photograph is a part of the Nesfield plan for the Avenue Garden in Regent's Park. That's mildly better. That's the Royal Parks proposed planting plan for it when the scheme was restored a few years ago. I hope you've all been there to see it by now. Notice the effect of having planting that carefully distinguishes the edges from the rest of the planting scheme. And while there are limits to what can be done with the accuracy of this planting because of the disappearance of the specific cultivars named in the original plan. This is probably as good a replication as you can get, because at least the same broad categories of plants have been used, the same genera in any case. Well, everything we've been discussing so far really took place during about 3 months in the summer. And by 1850, there were already complaints in the gardening press that too much attention was being lavished on summer bedding. What about the other months of the year? I've only found one writer who actually praised the aesthetic appearance of empty beds, and he was an American tourist, not a British gardener, so obviously doesn't count. So, by 1850, the race was on to find ways of extending the principles that had now been worked out for summer planting into the other seasons of the year. Spring came first and was probably more successful. So this is John Fleming, the head gardener at Cliveden. The inventor, or at least probably the inventor of what became known as spring gardening, the inventor of carpet bedding, and as reasonable a choice as anybody else for the inventor of the wild garden, if you have to have one. And this was the area he had to use, the main parterre at Cliveden. And that's the one colour scheme published. Basically, in the autumn, after the summer bedding was removed, he would plant it up with a mixture of spring bulbs, which included tulips, anemones, ranunculus, jonquils, but not other daffodils. They really didn't come back into popularity until the 1880s, and anemones. And he tried hard to get effects that were as vivid as those of summer bedding, but the nature of the plants meant that he often couldn't. Nonetheless, by the 1860s, a number of people were finding that this rather more pastel planting was frequently quite refreshing by comparison with what had become a fairly standard thing during the summer. And I'll just remind you of the state of Cliveden in the hands of the National Trust, which you might call efficient for maintenance, but not exactly a restoration of the Victorian garden. Well, Fleming had an important rival, William Ingram, the head gardener at Belvoir Castle. And by the 1870s, there was a priority dispute taking place between them. William Robinson and his magazine, The Garden, stood mainly on Ingram's side. I think the documentation shows that Fleming was first in the field, but it was really an ideological conflict. Fleming's most famous experiments in spring gardening were in that geometric parterre. Ingram's flower beds tended to flow smoothly over the landscape, and in those early years of Robinson's magazine, The Garden, basically having flower beds on grass instead of gravel was almost sufficient to get them called natural looking. But beds that did not have a rigid geometric structure and that adapted themselves to the terrain definitely looked natural by comparison with what had gone before. Remember this if you think of the 1870s being the time when William Robinson brought things back to nature. It's not quite as you might have understood it. And there's a photograph showing one of the flower beds at Belvoir Castle in the Edwardian period, when Ingram's successor, W.H. Divers, was planting. And notice the immense degree of detail that goes into creating this naturalistic-looking bed. Now, that is spring. At the other end of the season, during the 1860s, chrysanthemums became popular as a means of extending the season from another 2 months into the autumn. And from about 1862 to the late 80s, the inner and middle temple gardens vied every year for their chrysanthemum displays. But there was never any great body of literature on how to try to affect color schemes for the autumn garden. It's as though the limited nature of the plants available made people resign themselves to just having an interesting collection of plants. Also, if you were the gardener at an estate where the family insisted on staying at home during the winter instead of going down to London like civilized people, you could try your hand at winter bedding. And there's an illustration of winter bedding at Heckfield House in Hampshire. And when the chrysanthemums were over, Wildsmith, the head gardener, would replace them with a mixture of heathers and hollies and dwarf conifers and ivies. Now, this is a form of Victorian bedding that could easily be replicated today, except, of course, if people did it today, they'd no doubt want it as permanent planting rather than something that just went in for the winter. Now, all this has brought us up merely to the middle of the 1860s, when great changes started to take place. The Gardener's Chronicle, about 1865, remarked that it seemed only a year ago that everybody was talking about flowers, and now nobody wanted to hear about them. All anybody was interested in was foliage. The interest in foliage gardening had gradually been creeping up during the 1850s, starting with the fashion for ferns. And in the mid-1860s, it suddenly exploded. It became known in England as subtropical gardening, after the subtropical garden in Battersea Park, which the superintendent John Gibson arranged. But basically, for a period of something exceeding a quarter of a century, a perfectly acceptable form of summer bedding outdoors consisted not of pelargoniums and their ilk, but of caladiums, philodendrons, dieffenbachias, rex begonias, shrubby solanums, and any number of other foliage plants with large, brightly colored, interestingly shaped leaves. The proponents of subtropical gardening argued for its superiority over traditional summer bedding, not only because it was longer lasting and more durable, even if most of the plants had to go back in the greenhouse eventually, but also because of the subtler range of colors. You just could not get the high contrasts of summer bedding with plants whose leaves ran to a mixture of greens, reds, browns, and purples. And a young generation of gardeners, whom William Robinson is probably the most articulate, grew up for whom this more refined range of colors became the ideal. Here is an illustration of the dell in Hyde Park in the 1870s, showing the effect. And there you can see it carrying on at the turn of the century. In municipal parks, subtropical gardening carried on a great deal longer than it did on private estates. One of William Robinson's first books was called The Subtropical Garden, and it was a little manual for the middle-class suburban householder on how he could get the same effects using hardy plants that did not need protected cultivation during the winter. So this is the period when bamboos and pampas grass start hitting the garden in force. As I said, by about 1890, the major interest in subtropical gardening has passed. You can find gardens that still carry on doing it, but one can think of purely technical reasons as well as aesthetic ones for its eventual demise from the private estate. Bringing your pelargoniums indoor for the winter is one thing, but bringing your banana indoors for the winter requires resources that the middle-class householder probably did not have. However, not all the plants that became popular as part of this cult of foliage were large. Some of them were quite small, dwarf succulents, sedums, and creeping plants like alternantheras and irisenes. In 1868, at Cliveden, John Fleming created a series of beds which included the Countess of Sutherland's monogram created in dwarf succulents on a bed of sedum. The Gardener's Chronicle coined the term carpet bedding because the thick foliage texture of these beds reminded them of the texture of a Turkish carpet, and recommended that everybody try it next year. By 1870, it had hit Q. And in the 1870s, more gardens are described for their carpet bedding than for their flowers. It was the major fashion of the decade. Even William Robinson managed to get an approval for carpet bedding into his book Alpine Flowers for English Gardens. He's usually remembered for attacking carpet bedding later on in life, but he was also the first English gardener to write a book which contained a recommendation for carpet bedding, and this is one of the very pretty beds that he liked at that period in his life. Although it has to be admitted, his favorite was this one in Battersea Park, in which the planting mounds with Antonaria tomentosa created the effect of snow on distant hills, if you look at it from far enough away and have a good imagination. Even after he turned against alternantheras and irisenes, Robinson still retained an affection for dwarf succulents, and he tried to promote the bedding of these as a separate gardening form, which he called mosaiculture. As this was the term used in France for carpet bedding generally, it never really caught on, but here you can see from the turn of the century in Brockwell Park in South London, a purely dwarf succulent bed. And there you can see a view of a mixture of carpet beds and ordinary summer beds in a builder's back garden in Hackney in the 1870s. And if you wanted public displays of carpet bedding, the place to go was Hampton Court. Right up until the First World War, Hampton Court was probably had the best collection of carpet beds in a public garden around London. And there was a press outcry when at the end of the First World War, the beds having been grassed over for the duration, it was announced they would not be reinstated, but there would be an attempt to restore Hampton Court to something like its 18th century effect. And this press outcry had about as much impact as press outcries usually do. Carpet bedding took on a new form in the mid-1870s. This is George Thompson, then superintendent of Crystal Palace Park. And in 1875, he planted a series of carpet beds at Crystal Palace in the shape of butterflies. Nothing like this had ever quite been seen before. And while I suspect that the proponents of historical revivalism didn't mind carpet bedding at first, because you could always turn the pattern of your Adams ceiling into a carpet bed pattern, there was no precedent for this. And I find it not coincidental that it's about this time that you begin to get the historical revivalists starting to insist more radically on accuracy of planting as well as accuracy of design. And it's now time to change carousels. I'm going to break chronology just for a moment to indicate that carpet bedding went on even further later. In 1889, the Gardener's Chronicle visited Halton, one of the Rothschild estates in Buckinghamshire, and reported this interesting creation, a galvanized wire frame packed with peat in which the carpet bedding plants were inserted to create a three-dimensional carpet bed in the shape of a vase. This time, they didn't recommend that everybody try it next year. And outside the Rothschilds, I don't know of anybody who was doing this until after the turn of the century in England, but the example spread. And William Robinson, by the end of the century, was expressing alarm that things like this were reported from America and wished they would hope they would never come to England. But of course they did. This, one of the wittiest things in the history of gardening, this genuine carpet bed, was a pattern that appeared in 1903 and became very popular. In fact, it was the first pattern to be reinstated at Blackpool after the Second World War. And three-dimensional carpet bedding from just before the First World War became a major element in the park superintendent's repertoire. You have things such as coronation crowns. 1911 was a very good year for coronation crowns. The floral staircase at Bridlington. The floral organ in Bradford. Another park in Bradford had a floral piano the same year. The floral cenotaph in Maidstone. Like to find the park superintendent who would do something as courageous as that today. But of course, the most widespread of such designs was the floral clock. The first in Great Britain was at Princes Street Gardens in Edinburgh, 1903, designed by John McHattie, the park superintendent, formerly head gardener to the Duke of Wellington. Probably not the first in the world. And by the 1930s, when Pettigrew wrote his textbook on making parks, he had to insist that not every park needs a floral clock. And if you go into a public park and you find a bed that has been deliberately built up into an angle without any obvious reason for it, there may well be the mechanism of a clock lurking under there. However, the pundits of the late 19th century might have just taken this series of photographs as an indication that they were right. This sort of thing ought never to have been brought to England. So let's jump back. Along with the sudden interest in foliage came new ideas about the proper combination of colors. One of the pioneers, which was Shirley Hibbard, who began in the 1860s recommending that gardens ought to be organized around one single color. He gave the example of a field full of buttercups. One color, but the tone of the color varied with the angle of vision. The further away you looked, the more it appeared a solid block of yellow. If you looked around your feet, it was much more mixed with green. And that idea of having one color but different gradations of it around the garden, he recommended as the proper way of planting a flower garden. And during the 1870s and 80s, this became pretty much the dominant way of organizing a flower garden, particularly when gardens began to abandon carpet bedding and move back into flower gardening again. Here is an Edwardian photograph of the parterre at Waddesdon Manor, and you can see, by comparison with what you were looking at earlier, the shift in colour values brought on. You can see red is very definitely the dominant colour. The other colours of yellow, blue, and white are very much just minor punctuation marks by comparison. At this point, what I ought to have done, if I had remembered to look in the right box, was to show you a photograph of the recent restoration of the parterres at Waddesdon Manor based on this series of photographs. I haven't brought the photograph with me, so just trot up to Aylesbury and have a look for yourself. This is William Wildsmith, who was one of the major gardening writers of the 1880s, and particularly associated with the idea of having a garden in which you couldn't tell what colour was dominant. Here you can see a view of Heckfield as it's starting to emerge from the dominance of carpet bedding, a mixture of carpet beds, perennial beds, and shrub beds. And during the 1880s, Wildsmith became more intent on exploring texture in the bed. So in addition to keeping the colours either neutral or so mixed that you couldn't tell which was dominant. Here you can see one of the last illustrations of Heckfield during his lifetime. He began planting tall perennials in the beds, but not staking them, so they could grow into each other and compete. And the Gardener's Chronicle, first trying to describe this effect, invoked the idea of survival of the fittest as an explanation for the aesthetic. But gradually, during the 1880s and 90s, this moved outward from Heckfield Place and became the basis of what later was called arts and crafts planting, in which whatever the formal edges defined for your flower beds, the plants are encouraged to spread over them to get into the paving and create an effect of burgeoning, bountiful life rather than rigid demarcation. And the floral trends of this last period can be indicated with three views about 15 years apart of the same garden. This is Brantingham Thorpe in East Yorkshire. Here you can see it in the 1870s with carpet bedding in Prince of Wales feathers and fleur-de-lis patterns. And here it is in the 1890s with tuberous begonias and alyssum. Tuberous begonias began to hit the market in the mid-1870s and were really the major rival for pelargoniums in flower gardens in the last quarter of the century. And finally, in the Edwardian period, roses. All through the Victorian period, roses tended to be kept away from the main parterre in a secluded area of the garden by themselves, known naturally as the rosary. Partly, of course, because they didn't look like much for a great chunk of the year, but also because until virtually the end of the century, the tones of roses were considered to be rather too, in some cases, pastel, at least not vivid enough to really fit in with summer bedding. It was only toward the 1890s that the flame-coloured, magenta-coloured roses began to appear, and by the end of the 90s, you get the first reports of rose beds out in the open in municipal parks and on the parterre. I think Luton Hoo, about 1910, is the first country house estate I can think of where the parterre is actually specifically laid out as a rose garden. Well, along with these changes in colour preference came an attempt to get away from the bedding plants of the 1840s to 60s and start bringing back more hardy plants into the flower garden. This is Blickling in the the photograph probably dates from the end of the 1880s, but the scheme was laid out in the 70s. The overall design of the garden was Nesfield and his son, but the Marchioness of Lothian overruled the Nesfield plan for the flower garden and laid this one out herself. Each bed devoted to a particular category of herbaceous plant. Alas, I've never seen a published colour scheme. Now, the rhetoric of William Robinson and his followers rather suggests that the herbaceous border is a late 19th century innovation. It wasn't. As early as the 1820s, you find Loudon recommending the Parkinson's Paradisus terrestris as a model for planting herbaceous borders. There are herbaceous borders marked on a plan of Arley Hall in the 1840s, at a time when Gertrude Jekyll was about 9 and William Robinson 9 and Gertrude Jekyll about 4. And in the 1850s, Donald Beaton was writing that now that we had solved the problems of design of the arrangement of plants in the parterre, now we ought to go to work on our mixed borders. That is the next great challenge in gardening. All through the 1850s and 60s, there were experiments with the arrangement of mixed borders. But the general attitude of the gardening press was that nobody had produced anything really satisfactory. Part of the reason, of course, being that they were looking for the sort of color values that you got in the parterre. And plants characteristic of the herbaceous border tended to be a bit too tall, with too much foliage showing underneath, really to fit into that sort of block color scheme. What was needed was a change of attitude whereby details rather than overall plan was looked at. In the 1870s, the gardening writer D.T. Fish reiterated Beaton's complaint that he'd never seen a well-arranged mixed border. And the painter Frank Miles wrote to William Robinson saying, "Why don't you offer mine as an example?" So Robinson produced this bit of a plan of Miles's border in his book on hardy flowers in 1873. Now, as plans go, it's not very helpful because do these asterisks each indicate an individual plant, or do they sometimes indicate just the mixture in the middle of a clump of plants? It would be very helpful if some lines were drawn around. However, there you can see the border at Arley Hall before it was jecalized at the end of the 19th century. And again, an illustration from Robinson's English Flower Garden to give the effect sought for. Very great emphasis in this period on tall plants, delphiniums, hollyhocks, rockets, etc. What plans you see for borders in this period still show them being laid out in fairly uniform rows or blocks. But then in the 1890s, along came Gertrude Jekyll. Here is a plan from a lecture she gave to the RHS in 1897 on how to plant borders. And you can see the principle of pseudo-naturalistic drifts being substituted for uniform rows and blocks. And this caught on very quickly. By about 1912, you have Backhouse's nursery giving proposed planting plans in their catalogues. The pseudo-naturalistic drifts may look a bit regimented and uniform by comparison with Jekyll's, but after all, there's the difference between a garden designer and a nursery firm. And an Edwardian illustration to show the effect being aimed at. And one of Jekyll's. Now, to finish, I'll just say that although we may think of the Victorian period as being the heyday of the bedding system, it did not stop with the First World War. Even on private estates, it continued, and continued to develop in various ways. Here's a 1920s example of bedding using antirrhinums and other plants from Sutton's. And of course, it continued particularly in municipal parks. And although the gardening press in the 20th century has tended to look down on park bedding as being somehow infra-dig, it had very practical as well as aesthetic significance in the park, and this photograph of Halifax before the Clean Air Act might indicate why. Right, there should have been another photograph in there showing a view of Phillips Park, Manchester, a photograph labeled "The Big Trees," showing a little group of trees about the size of your average London plain. Phillips Park was in the worst polluted area of Manchester, the middle of the alkali industry. And in 1929, statistics were published in the Gardener's Chronicle about the effects of air pollution on the planting. A very small list of plants, which included rhododendrons, poplars, hostas, a shrubby honeysuckle called Linicera ledibourii, elders, etc. About a dozen species or genera were listed that were capable of surviving outdoors during the winter at Phillips Park. Even of these, the lifespan was not long. Rhododendrons tended to last only 3 years. They reliably flowered only in the first year because the flower buds were already formed when they were brought in from the nursery in the country. Some flowered in the second year, but mostly they just put on new wood, and at the end of the third year had to be thrown away. The lifespan of poplars was somewhat longer, but even so, every year, about 3,000 rhododendrons, 3,000 poplars, 2,500 elders, etc., were planted to make good the losses. So what could the park superintendent do when what we now call structure planting could not be expected to grow up to maturity? And the answer is, you rely on seasonal bedding. That's Phillips Park with the Parks Inspection Committee visiting in 1913. So right up until the Clean Air Act in the 1960s, bedding had a very useful place in the municipal park. But the changes in bedding styles during the 20th century are outside the remit of this talk, which I see has considerably overrun. I'll stop. Now, Ted, you've no time for your discussion.
No, we're not going to have that. I expect we'd like to ask you some questions now. I'll start with one.
Yes.
What are the plants that are usually used for the edging around the place?
No particular list of plants used for edgings as opposed to centers, except that it was preferable that they be lower.
Because they're very effective edgings. That last one you showed us. Extremely well-defined edgings with precise little plants all the way along. One thinks of violas and so on, but I don't know if that's right at all.
By the time of that photograph of Phillips Park, quite possibly. Pansies tended to be more plants for the border and the show bench than for beds in the middle of the 19th century, but they were certainly creeping into bedding before the end of the century. But basically, the main thing for edging is that it should contrast with the center of the bed and not extend higher than the plants in the bed. That latter thing, of course, could be helped by a bit of mounding in select places.
Now then, others.
Yes?
Your last point about pollution in the cities, how did the bedding plants cope with that sort of degree of air pollution? Were they all right for just one season?
No doubt there had to be a certain amount of replacement of plants over the course of the season, but most parks had their own greenhouses, so it was something that could be done without too much difficulty. Yes?
I was looking at some sales particulars for the 1850s, and the estate agent referred to various items in the garden, including a French garden. What would they have meant at that time by a French garden?
It's not a term often come upon at that period, the most famous one being at Chatsworth. Basically, it means a garden laid out according to what, in the early 19th century, people who hadn't been to France thought Versailles and so on looked like. In other words, a scheme of beds, usually box-edged.
Sorry. Been requested to put blinds up. I don't quite know why. It's a bloody nuisance.
And
that's quite enough.
More or less geometric in shape. But by the 1850s, it was a term that was already almost slipping into oblivion, because with the rise of Nesfield style, something that looked more genuinely French was around and not particularly associated with France either. Because what Nesfield would like to emphasize was the English antecedents for it.
What do you think the plants might have been?
I think the plants would probably have been, in the 1850s, the standard bedding plants of the day. No indication that anybody tried making beds of tube roses or things like that, a la Trianon. Next. Hello? Anybody?
Well, I've got an obvious question. They're wonderful photographs of 19th century gardens. You can see why, except in quite rare cases, that it would be impossible or unsuitable to recreate them in public gardens and public parks because of the massive amount of maintenance required. And people aren't born to spend their lives doing that sort of work, I don't think. It's not suitable. So I think large-scale reproduction of these sort of gardens is just not on now.
Well, there are two parts to that argument, one of which seems to involve the simple costs or timing of maintenance, and the other an argument about human dignity. To take the first one, this again is one of the reasons why carpet bedding has had such a long life through the 20th century, because whatever the effort of setting up the carpet bed in the first place, its maintenance thereafter is much less than that of ordinary flower gardens. If the plants start getting a bit large, you clip them. You don't do that with a bed of pelargoniums. As for the argument about human dignity, there's been one of the arguments used in recent times to promote the resurgence of carpet bedding and presumably of other forms of bedding in municipal parks has been to label it craftsman gardening, by people who take a pride in creating a beautiful set of flower beds or carpet beds and have the technique to do it. So there's more than one view of what is appropriate human labor.
Can I just mention that Waterston never used...
This is the computerized...
Yeah, the computer-generated designing and pre-doing all the carpet bedding in mats which are delivered on site and just have to be put in the right place, so they don't... Each plant doesn't have to be individually planted now.
Yes, this has been happening for 3 years now at Waterston, and it's made the creation of the carpet beds a great deal easier. It can all be done in one day, weather permitting, whereas it took at least 3 days to get the same effect before. Hasn't really been tried for pelargoniums and the like yet, but we will no doubt see it eventually. Out else?
Has
Yes.
there been any, is there any indication that the public enjoy those kinds of gardens more than...
Yes. First of all, using an old example that you might, of course, argue doesn't apply to the present day, but when in the Edwardian period the Royal Parks began cutting down the carpet bedding in Hyde Park, it got to the point that around the last carpet bed, a metal railing had to be erected to prevent it from being damaged by the crush of people around it. And into our own time, one of the things that actually brings unsolicited letters of approval to a parks department has been planting carpet beds. It can be usually, assuming it's done competently, it can be relied upon actually to bring in spontaneous notices of appreciation from the public, which lots of other things in parks don't.
Sorry, I've been asked to say my name again. It's Beverly Lear. I just wanted to actually pick up on the point about these big, huge structures of carpet bedding and say that I think it was probably 2 or 3 years ago that I was in Bath and noticed that every single roundabout had huge, great Roman centurions in carpet bedding, all neatly done around the edges with ribbon bedding and things. And I think that I must have seen 4 or 5 centurions, and I think therefore it isn't entirely beyond the resources or human dignity of parks departments to recreate some of these Victorian landscapes.
Well, indeed not. There started to be a resurgence in the late 1980s when Torbay started exhibiting examples at Chelsea, and that brought a certain degree of national attention to what had been, in various places, still intermittently carried on. Bath being another place. I can remember the Wombles as a 3-dimensional carpet bedding scheme in the early 80s. But yes, it is not very frequent, but it is met with, and I suspect rather enjoyed by the locals and visitors. After all, there's no reason why gardening should not be capable of incorporating some humor. Anybody else? Hello?
One last thing on edging.
Yep.
You get that round rose bed so that you're right outside your building. Does it stop promptly? Does it stop promptly with herbaceous borders?
Does it stop promptly?
Yes, an edging round a herbaceous border. Is that a thing that never happens?
No, it certainly has happened, and probably in the mid-19th century it happened more often than at other times, but you certainly don't tend to see it late in the century. You also don't tend to see it much in illustrations, but you can find references to it in the literature, including the use of ferns as an edging around herbaceous borders.
Found to be impractical, I suppose, with spreading plants.
Possibly.
Well, fine.
Certainly probably rather inconsistent with Wilde-Smithian principles of letting the vegetation go where it wanted.
Well, Brent, you've given us an absolutely splendid last lecture of the day. We could be relied upon to do it, and you've done it. So thank you very much.